Vor had been writing for 3 hours when the wall shook. Not the gentle vibration of the atmospheric processors cycling through their morning sequence, which was a sound he had learned in the first weeks on Kepler Colony 7 and had stopped noticing within the first month. Not the distant rumble of the agricultural equipment working the eastern fields, which ran from before dawn, and which his body had incorporated into sleep the way bodies incorporated familiar sounds. This was different. This was the kind of sound that did not belong to a colony going about its morning, the kind that arrived without warning and changed the quality of the air in the room, the kind that Vor had heard once before in his life, 19 years ago, on a different world, in the last hour before that world stopped being a world his people lived on. He stopped writing. Vale looked up from the table where she had been doing her mathematics homework, the kind of homework that human schools assigned on paper, because the teachers believed that writing by hand built something in the mind that screens did not, a philosophy that Vor, as a historian who had spent his life writing by hand in his own language, found deeply sensible. She was 12 years old and had her grandmother's eyes, and those eyes were looking at him now with the specific attention of a child, who had learned to read his face the way you learned to read the faces of people who carried things they did not speak about directly. She said, "Grandfather, what is that?" It was not quite a question. She was 12 years old and she had grown up on Kepler Colony 7 among Solvari elders who had survived things she had only heard described, and she had learned early that the difference between a question and a statement was sometimes the difference between wanting an answer and already knowing one. Vor looked at her. He looked at the homework on the table, at the pencil she was still holding, at the window that showed Kepler 7's orange morning sky, clear and warm, the particular color that the atmospheric processors produced when they were running at optimal calibration, a color that did not exist on the Solvari homeworld, and that he had spent the first year here finding strange and had spent the next 18 years finding home. He said, "It means we were found." Vale set down her pencil. She said, "By who?" Vor listened to the sound in the wall. In the distance, through the settlement's public address system, he could hear the emergency protocol beginning to activate, not the words yet, just the tone that preceded the words, the specific frequency that the human engineers had calibrated to carry through every structure in the colony without distortion. He said, "By the people who destroyed our home." Vale looked at him for a moment. She did not cry. She did not panic. She was 12 years old and she had grown up among survivors, and something of the way survivors held themselves had gotten into her bones without anyone teaching it deliberately. She said, "What do we do?" Vor looked toward the northern edge of the settlement, where the defense installations were, where the human military infrastructure had been present since the first day of the colony's existence, where Admiral Ruth Carver's 14 ships held their positions in the space above, and the ground crews maintained the systems that Vor had watched being constructed over 3 years without fully understanding what he was watching. He said, "We trust the humans." 19 years ago, the sound had been different. Vor had been in the archive building in Solvari's capital when the Kreth Dominion's reclamation fleet dropped out of FTL above the homeworld, and the sound that time had been a sound that the entire planet heard simultaneously, the specific resonance of 200 warships entering a planetary system at combat speed, without declaration or warning or any of the diplomatic formalities that the Solvari had believed, in their complete and catastrophic naivety, or simply how things were done between civilizations. They had believed this because they had never needed to believe otherwise. The Solvari were historians, architects, farmers, musicians, teachers. They had been building things and recording things and growing things on their world for 4,000 years of continuous civilization. They had encountered other species and traded with them, and learned from them, and occasionally disagreed with them through processes that eventually produced resolutions. They had never needed weapons because the universe, in their experience, was a place where weapons were not the primary language. They were wrong about the universe. The Dominion was the correction. 200 ships in 6 hours, and the homeworld was gone as a place where the Solvari lived, reduced to a place where the Dominion's extraction equipment operated, and the surviving Solvari population, those who had not escaped, were processed into the labor classification system that the Dominion maintained with the thoroughness of an organization that believed in accurate record-keeping. HFY War had escaped on a transport with 300 others. The transport had been a cargo vessel retrofitted for evacuation in the 6 hours between the Dominion's arrival and the completion of their surface operation, hastily enough that it should not have worked and thoroughly enough that it did, because the person who had done the retrofitting was a Solvari engineer named Veth who had decided that the transport would work, and had made that decision absolute in the way that certain people made certain decisions in certain moments. Veth had not made it onto the transport himself. HFY War had written that in his history and had never found the right words for it, and had stopped trying to find the right words, and had simply written what happened and let the facts carry the weight. 300 Solvari in a cargo vessel with nowhere to go. They had tried 17 species. HFY War had written all 17 in his history, had written their names and their responses, had tried to write those responses with the fairness of a historian rather than the anger of a survivor, and had found that fairness and anger could coexist in the same document if you were careful about which words you used where. The responses had varied in language and diplomatic formulation, but had been consistent in substance. The Dominion was too large and too established, and too present a force in the galaxy for any species of reasonable size to antagonize by sheltering its escaped labor assets. This was not a moral position. It was a practical one. And practical positions, the 17 species had communicated in their various ways, were the foundation of continued existence. HFY War understood. He had written that he understood. Understanding did not make the transport less crowded or the air recyclers less strained or the children less frightened. They had been in transit for 11 days, running on recycled air and emergency rations and the specific human quality. Though HFY War did not think of it as a human quality then, he thought of it as a Solvari quality, not knowing yet that it was more universal than that, of continuing to do the next thing because the next thing was there to do. On the 12th day, a patrol vessel had intercepted them. The patrol vessel was human. HFY War had encountered humans twice in his career as a historian, brief diplomatic exchanges that had produced polite documents. He had formed no strong impressions. They were a young species, relatively new to interstellar travel, interesting in the way that young species were interesting to a historian who appreciated the particular energy of civilizations that had not yet calcified their thinking. The patrol vessel had signaled them on standard frequency. Identify yourself and state your purpose. Standard procedure, the kind of thing patrol vessels did when unknown vessels appeared in their sector. HFY War had transmitted everything. Not a summary, everything. The homeworld, the Dominion, the 300 survivors, the 11 days, the 17 species, everything, because he was a historian and historians gave you the complete record and let you decide what to do with it. The pause after the transmission lasted 40 seconds. HFY War had counted. Then the patrol vessel commander, a 26-year-old lieutenant named Marcus Webb on his first posting, a fact HFY War had learned later and had added to his history because the age mattered, the inexperience mattered, the first posting mattered, because what you did before you had accumulated reasons to be cautious was the truest expression of what you actually were, said 4 words. Follow me, you're safe. HFY War had written those 4 words in his history and had written them in English, not in translation. Because they needed to be in the language they were spoken in, because translation would change something essential about them, the specific plainness of them, the way they contained everything necessary and nothing unnecessary. Follow me, you're safe. He had spent 19 years trying to write what came after those 4 words. The colony that had not existed and then existed. The buildings built to Solvari specifications by human engineers who had never built for Solvari before and had spent 6 months learning what Solvari specifications were before they started. The atmospheric processors tuned to Solvari respiratory requirements. The agricultural zones growing Solvari crops that human botanists had learned to cultivate on soil that was not their crop's native soil, a process that had taken 2 years and had produced, eventually, food that tasted the way Calvor remembered food tasting on the homeworld, close enough that the first time he ate it he had to leave the table and stand outside for a while. The school where Solvari children learned their own history alongside human mathematics and science, taught by human teachers who had studied enough Solvari culture to teach it with accuracy, and enough respect to teach it with weight. The medical center where human doctors had spent years learning Solvari biology from the surviving medical personnel, and could now treat Solvari patients with the confidence of practitioners who knew what they were doing. The memorial in the settlement's central square, built by human hands from descriptions that Calvor and the other survivors had given over many sessions, a physical record of a world that no longer existed. No treaty had required any of this. No law had compelled it. No economic arrangement had made it profitable. 4 words from a 26-year-old lieutenant had become 19 years of human labor and human expertise and human lives spent on a colony, 30 light-years from Earth for people who were not human. Calvor had never fully understood why. He was a historian. Understanding why things happened was his entire professional purpose. He had interviewed every human on the colony he could interview, had read every document produced about the decision to build the settlement, had followed the bureaucratic and political trail of the choice from Lieutenant Webb's transmission back to the patrol commander's report to Sector Command, from Sector Command to UEDF Strategic Division, from Strategic Division to the Joint Committee that had approved the construction budget, from the committee to the floor of the human parliament where the vote had been taken. The vote had not been close, 87% in favor. He had read the debate transcripts. He had read the arguments for and against. The arguments against had been practical cost, resources, diplomatic risk, the Dominion question. The arguments for had been simple. The simplicity of them had stayed with him longer than the complexity of the arguments against. One parliament member, a woman from a place called New Zealand whose name was Aroha Ngata and who had been 63 years old at the time of the vote and was no longer alive, had said in the debate, "We can help them, so we will." 7 words, not as clean as 4 but close. We can help them, so we will. Calvor walked through the settlement on the morning of the alert, moving toward the observation post on the administrative building's upper level where he had decided he needed to be, and he recorded what he saw with his recorder running and his historian's attention on everything around him. The evacuation protocols were activating. Human administrators moving through the residential sectors with the practiced calm of people who had drilled this procedure many times and were now running it for real. The shelter network entrances opening, the reinforced doors that led down to the hardened levels beneath the settlement where there was food and water and medical supplies for 60 days, where the entire population could wait in safety while the situation above them resolved. Calvor watched Sarah Osai, a human teacher 32 years old who had come to Kepler Colony 7-8 years ago on a 3-year teaching contract, and had renewed it 3 times because she had told him once over tea in the settlement's community center. The children here were extraordinary learners, and she could not imagine being anywhere else. She was moving 30 Solvari children through a shelter entrance with the specific focus calm of someone who had one job in this moment, and was doing it with complete attention. Calvor watched her count the children as they went through, touching each one on the shoulder as they passed, a gesture that was not Solvari custom, but that the children had learned to accept from her as a specific kind of reassurance, the reassurance of being seen individually rather than as a group. He recorded it. He recorded everything. He reached the administrative building and went up to the observation level and stood at the window that showed the northern sky and the defense installations on the settlement's edge and the space above, where 14 human ships held their positions. His recorder ran. Below him, Vale went into the shelter with the other children. At the entrance she turned and looked up, scanning the building's face until she found the window where he was standing. She was too far away to read his expression, and he was too far away to read hers, but he had known her face for 12 years, and he knew what it looked like when she was being the kind of brave that was not the absence of fear, but the decision to do the next thing anyway. She had learned that from somewhere. He thought perhaps she had learned it from being surrounded for 12 years by people who did it. Solvari survivors and human teachers and human engineers and human doctors and human military personnel who had all, in their various ways, decided that the next thing needed doing and done it. She went into the shelter. Admiral Ruth Carver received Executor Crothsall's transmission at 8:47 hours and read it with the attention of someone who had been waiting for a transmission of this type for 3 years and had therefore already decided what her response would be before it arrived. She was 54 years old and had been in the UEDF for 30 years and had commanded the Kepler Sector Defense Forces for 3 of those years, an assignment she had not requested and had accepted because assignments were assignments, and because she was honest enough with herself to admit that after the first month, when she had read the full history of the colony and understood what it was and how it had come to exist, she had stopped thinking of it as an assignment and started thinking of it as a responsibility, which was a different thing in ways that mattered. She transmitted her response. She said, "Executor Crothsall, this is Admiral Ruth Carver, United Earth Defense Forces, Kepler Sector Command. I've received your transmission. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. There are 40,000 people on this colony. They have lived here for 19 years. Some of them were born here. I don't know what your files call them. I can tell you what we call them, residents, and nobody takes our residents." The response from the Dominion flagship took 11 seconds. Crothsall's voice had the quality of someone who had conducted 17 operations of this type and had developed a precise vocabulary for each stage of them. "Admiral, I have 43 vessels. Your defense complement in this sector is assessed at 14. I would ask you to consider what those numbers mean before this situation becomes costly for your people." Carver said, "I know the numbers. I want to tell you something about numbers, Executor. Your assessment of my defense complement is 14 months old. Numbers change in 14 months." She paused. "I also want to tell you that the moment your fleet appeared in this system, this command transmitted an automatic reinforcement request to Sector Command. Standard protocol for any unidentified fleet of your size appearing in a defended sector. That was 4 hours ago." Another pause. "Sector Command is 31 hours away. I want you to hold that number in your mind for the rest of this conversation." She cut the channel. She said to her tactical officer, "They're going to move when the deadline runs. 6 hours, use them." Her tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Yuki Torres, 29 years old, 3 years on Kepler sector duty, said, "Aye, Admiral. Grid status. Run the activation sequence. I want full diagnostic on all 47 installations before they move." She looked at the tactical display. 43 Dominion vessels holding at the system's edge, their formation precise and confident. "And get me the enduring promise. I want Captain Osei on the line." The 6 hours ran. Below the settlement, in the shelter network, 40,000 Solvari and 8,000 humans waited in the specific quality of waiting that came from not knowing what was happening above you and having decided to trust the people dealing with it. Cale Vor was not in the shelter. He was at the observation window with his recorder running, and he was aware that this was not the rational choice, and had made it anyway because he was a historian, and the rational choice and the right choice were not always the same choice. He watched the northern sky. At 14:47 hours, the Dominion fleet moved. Crothsall brought his fleet in on the standard reclamation approach vector, the one he had used 17 times, the one that the Dominion's tactical manual specified for operations involving a civilian installation with limited military defense. Controlled advance, overwhelming force demonstration, designed to make resistance feel futile before resistance became engagement, because resistance that became engagement was expensive, and the Dominion preferred efficiency. He noted the 14 human vessels repositioning as his fleet advanced. He noted their formation with the attention of an experienced commander assessing an opposing force, and he found the formation competent but insufficient. 14 ships against 43 was mathematics, and mathematics was not a matter of competence. He did not note the colony defense grid, because the colony defense grid did not appear on his sensors as a defense grid. It appeared as atmospheric processing equipment, which was what it appeared to be to any sensor sweep looking for military hardware using military emission signatures, because it did not use military emission signatures. It used the colony's main reactor, which read as civilian infrastructure, because it was civilian infrastructure. Civilian infrastructure that the UEDF's engineering division had spent 3 years quietly converting into 47 weapons installations without changing the reactor signature that sensors identified, because the engineers had been very specific about what they were building and what it needed to look like while they were building it. Carver waited. She needed the Dominion fleet at 400,000 kilometers, close enough for the grid's effective range, close enough for her ship's modified weapons systems to work at optimal efficiency in the engagement geometry she had planned, close enough that the Dominion's formation would be committed to the approach vector and unable to redistribute quickly when the situation changed. 412,000 kilometers, she said, all ships engage, grid activate. The first 3 minutes were the worst 3 minutes of Ruth Carver's professional life. The Dominion hit hard, and they hit with the precision of a fleet that had done this before and knew how to do it efficiently. Commander Lisa Park on the Resolute took a direct hit to the command section in the first 40 seconds, a hit that destroyed the bridge and killed the command staff before the ship's automatic systems registered the damage. The Resolute continued on its last heading for 11 seconds before secondary systems failed, and it went dark. Cale Vore at the observation window saw the light. He had seen lights like that before. 19 years ago, above a different world, those lights had been Solvari ships, the 3 civilian transports that had tried to run before the Dominion's fleet was fully in position, that had not made it. He had written those lights in his history and had spent 19 years carrying them. He kept his recorder running. His hands were steady. He did not know how his hands were steady, but they were, and he recorded. Carver said into the log, Resolute, Commander Lisa Park commanding crew of 204. 1 second, then. All ships maintain formation, keep firing. The Steadfast went 3 minutes and 17 seconds into the engagement. A sequential weapons strike from 3 Dominion vessels that had coordinated their firing solutions in the gap between the first volley and the UEDF fleet's repositioning. Lieutenant Commander James Ockhaffer had been in the UEDF for 20 years and had commanded the Steadfast for 2 of them, and had drilled his crew for this engagement 400 times in simulation. The simulation had not included the specific sequence that hit them. Simulations could not include everything. 211 crew. Carver logged it. She said the number the way she said everything straight because that was what the number deserved and what the people in it deserved. Then she said, grid shift targeting to the left flank elements. OS, bring the promise around their rear. The enduring promise was not in the Dominion's intelligence database because it had been designed specifically for the Kepler Colony 7 assignment and had never been deployed anywhere else. had been commissioned 14 months ago and had come directly to this system and had been here since, running the defense drills and calibration sequences and crew integration that turned a new ship into a functional fighting force. Captain Daniel Osai, 47 years old, had commanded it from the first day. He was Sarah Osai's older brother, a fact that was not operationally relevant and that he thought about sometimes anyway, the way you thought about things that put the work in personal terms. His sister had been teaching Silvari children on this colony for 8 years. He had been protecting it from orbit for 14 months. The promise came around the Dominion fleet's left flank on a heading that Krothsal's formation had not covered, because the formation had been designed for a 14-ship defense complement, and the promise's approach vector was not one of the 14 ships' established positions. It hit the Dominion's flank element with weapons systems that Krothsal's tactical officer would later describe, in the damage assessment report, as inconsistent with known UEDF armament specifications for any vessel in their database. They were inconsistent with known UEDF armament specifications because they had been developed specifically for this vessel for this assignment over 14 months of engineering work that had been classified at a level the Dominion's intelligence network could not access. 3 Dominion vessels went dark in 4 minutes. Then the grid found its rhythm. 47 installations, distributed across the colony's infrastructure, firing in coordinated sequences that the human targeting teams had spent 3 years optimizing for the specific approach vectors that the Dominion's tactical manual specified for reclamation operations against civilian installations. The optimization had required knowing the Dominion's tactical manual, which required having the Dominion's tactical manual, which the UEDF's intelligence division had acquired through means that Carver had not asked about in detail and did not need to know. The grid fired, and the Dominion's rear elements, which had advanced to within the grid's optimal range, because the optimal range was 400,000 kilometers, and Carver had waited until they were at 412,000, found themselves taking fire from a direction, and with a weapons signature that was not in any threat assessment they had been given for this operation. Krothsal watched 11 of his ships go dark in 90 seconds and said to his flag captain, in the quiet voice he used when situations required precision rather than volume, "They were expecting us." His flag captain said, "Yes, Executor." Krothsal looked at the tactical display. 32 remaining vessels, the 14 human ships pressing from the engagement side, reduced now to 12 after the Resolute and Steadfast, but pressing with the specific aggression of ships whose crews knew what was on the planet below them. The colony defense grid firing from below, the enduring promise working the flank. He said, "How long have those installations been operational?" His flag captain checked. "Construction began approximately 31 months ago, Executor. They have been fully operational for 18 months." Krothsal was quiet for a moment. "They started building them 8 months after the colony was established." "Yes, Executor." "Before we found the refugees." "Yes, Executor." "Before we began this operation." "Before any formal indication that we had located the refugees, Executor." "Yes." Krothsal looked at the tactical display and thought about what that meant. 8 months after establishing a refugee settlement, humanity had begun converting its civilian infrastructure into a weapons network, not in response to a threat, in anticipation of one. Because someone had looked at the situation, 40,000 refugees from a species destroyed by a Dominion reclamation operation, now living in a human colony, and had asked the question that led to the answer that led to 3 years of quiet construction. What happens when the Dominion finds them? And then had built the answer to that question into the colony's atmospheric processors and reactor systems and utility infrastructure, hidden in the signatures of civilian equipment, waiting. He said, "Get me there, Admiral." Carver accepted the channel. Crothsaw looked at her on the screen, 54 years old, the face of someone who had been doing one thing with complete focus for 40 minutes and was still doing it. He said, "Admiral, you called for reinforcements when we arrived. The moment your fleet appeared in this system, yes. Standard protocol. For any unidentified fleet of this size, yes. Sector command is 31 hours away." "That's correct. You fought knowing they would take 31 hours. Carver said, "I fought knowing they were coming. There's a difference." Crothsaw looked at the tactical display. 29 remaining vessels now. He had been running the calculation since the grid activated. He ran it again. He arrived at the same answer. He said, "2 of your ships." Carver's voice did not change. 415 people, yes. They knew this would happen, the crews. They knew the risk, yes. For people who are not human. Carver looked at him for a moment. For people in our sector, that's enough. Crothsaw ran the calculation one more time. 29 against 12 human ships and a colony defense grid, and one unclassified vessel that was doing things to his flank that his tactical systems had not projected. Plus, somewhere in the FTL transit distance that he had been calculating since the conversation began, the reinforcements. He said, "How long until your sector command reinforcements arrive?" Carver said, "I told you 31 hours. We're 4 hours into that." 27 hours. Yes. He looked at the display. His formation was compromised. His rear elements were dealing with grid fire that his crews had not trained for because his operational brief had not included a colony defense grid of this specification. His flank was occupied by a human vessel that was not in his database. 27 hours. He did not have 27 hours. He had not had this operation end this way before. 17 times. He had not had this. He said to his flag captain, "Stand down weapons." His flag captain said, "Executor." "Stand them down." A pause. "I, Executor." Crothsaw looked at Carver. "Admiral, I am withdrawing my fleet." Carver said, "I know." The Sylvari stays, all 40,000 of them. Every person born on this colony stays on this colony. That was never negotiable, Executor. I need you to understand that. From the first word of your transmission this morning, it was never a question. Crothsaw looked at her for a moment. He had 17 operations in his record. He had never had an admiral tell him that something was never a question with the specific quality that Carver said it. The quality of someone who was not performing certainty but actually had it. Had it the way you had things that did not require decision, because they had already been decided, perhaps long before this morning. Perhaps the moment she had taken this assignment and read the history of what the colony was. He said, "Admiral, the grid, the installations, you built them into the civilian infrastructure." Yes. 8 months after the colony was established. 7 months and 22 days, Carver said. I read the construction records when I took command. You anticipated this operation. Someone did. I inherited the plan. I'm glad they made it. Crothsaw nodded once, which was a gesture that meant something specific in Kreth physiology and that Carver would not know the meaning of. He cut the channel. He said to his fleet, "All ships, withdrawal vector, maintain formation." The Dominion fleet turned. Kael'vor watched it from the observation window. He watched 29 vessels begin their withdrawal, watched them move away from the colony and away from the 12 human ships that held their positions without pursuing, watched the space above Kepler Colony 7 become quieter and quieter as the Dominion formation shrank on the horizon. He was still recording. He did not stop recording when the last Dominion vessel cleared the system's inner boundary. He did not stop when the all-clear tone came through the settlement's public address system. He stood at the observation window and recorded the orange sky and the human ships above it, and the settlement below him, and the specific quality of a morning that had been one thing and had become something else, and was now settling into the aftermath of that change. Then he put the recorder in his pocket. He walked down from the observation level. He walked through the settlement, past the memorial in the central square that human hands had built from Silvari descriptions, past the agricultural zones where Silvari crops grew in human-managed soil, past the school where human teachers taught Silvari children their own history. He walked and he cried. He was not aware of deciding to cry. He became aware that he was crying and made no effort to stop because he was a historian and historians recorded what was true, and this was true. The specific weight of something he had been carrying for 19 years had shifted, not lifted. It would never lift. Grief did not lift. It became part of how you moved but shifted, redistributed somehow, changed in character by the morning's events into something he did not have a word for in his own language. He was standing at the entrance to the shelter network when Sarah Osai came up the stairs from below, one of the first humans to emerge as the all-clear spread through the shelter levels. She was still in the focused mode of someone who had been doing one job and had done it, slightly disheveled from 6 hours underground, checking her comm for the update that was coming through about the situation above. She saw him. She looked at him for a moment, at his face, at the recorder in his hand. She came to stand beside him, and she looked up at the orange sky and the shape of human ships holding their positions in it. She said, "They're gone." Kael'vor said, "Yes." She said, "You okay?" He looked at her. 32 years old, 3-year contract renewed twice. The shoulder touch that Silvari children had learned to accept as a specific kind of reassurance. He had interviewed her once 2 years ago for his history. He had asked her why she had stayed when her original contract ended, and she had said, without much deliberation, that the children here were extraordinary learners and she could not imagine being anywhere else. He said, "I have been trying for 19 years to understand why your people did this, why you built this colony, why your ships fought for it today." Sarah looked at him. She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "No treaty required it, no law, you had nothing to gain from it. Every other species we approached told us the practical reason they could not help us. 17 species with practical reasons." He stopped. "I have been writing the history of my people for 19 years. What we were, what was taken from us, what came after. I have tried to write what humanity did, and I have never found the right words for it." Sarah was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the sky. Then she said, with the specific simplicity of someone who had genuinely not thought about this the way he had, because to her it did not require the kind of thinking he had given it, "You needed help." Kael'vor looked at her. "That's it," she said. "You needed help. What else were we supposed to do?" He stood with that for a moment. He had spent 19 years looking for the answer in documents and debate transcripts and committee minutes and interviews. He had followed the bureaucratic trail of the decision from Lieutenant Webb's 4 words to the Parliament vote to the construction crews to the defense grid to this morning. What else were we supposed to do? He went to the shelter. The Silvari population was beginning to come up, the shelter's levels emptying in the organized sequence the evacuation protocol specified, and Kael'vor moved against the flow of people coming up because he needed to go down, needed to find Vale in the specific section where the children had been sheltered. She found him first. She was 12 years old and she was faster than him, and she knew his face in a crowd the way children knew the faces they needed. She wrapped her arms around him and he held her and felt the specific weight of her, 12 years old, born on this colony, the only home she had ever known. She had her grandmother's eyes, and she was alive, and the Dominion was gone, and the morning was still orange outside. She said into his shoulder, "Is it over?" He said, "Yes." "Did the humans?" "Yes." She pulled back and looked at him. Her face was the face of someone who had been in a shelter for 6 hours with 30 other children and a human teacher who counted them one by one as they went through the door, and had decided, at some point in those 6 hours, that it was going to be all right. He did not know how she had decided this. He suspected she had decided it the same way she decided most things, which was by looking at the people around her and reading what they were doing and concluding from the evidence. She said, "I knew they would." Vor said, "You knew." "They always do." She said it the way she said things that were obvious to her, the specific confidence of someone who had grown up in a place and learned its character the way you learned the character of places you had grown up in. That's what they do. They help. Vor stood in the shelter with his granddaughter's arms around him and thought about what she had said. That's what they do. They help. He had been a historian for 40 years. He had spent his career looking for the words that accurately described things, the words that carried the weight of what had actually happened, without distorting it through interpretation or sentimentality, or the particular failure of historians who became advocates for the things they were documenting. He had written 4,000 pages of the history of his people, and had not found the right words for this. A 12-year-old girl had found them in one sentence. That's what they do, they help. He took his recorder out of his pocket. He turned it on. He stood in the shelter beneath the colony that humanity had built and defended with ships and weapons and 415 lives, and he said, into the recorder, in his own language because his own language was nearly extinct and writing in it kept it alive, what he was going to write next. He said, the final chapter. He said, it begins with 4 words. He said, a 26-year-old lieutenant, first posting, unknown species in a cargo transport with nowhere to go, 40 seconds of silence after receiving the complete record of what had happened to them, then 4 words. Follow me, you're safe. He said, 19 years later, those 4 words have become this. A colony of 40,000 people who had no home, a memorial built by human hands from Silvari descriptions, children who dream in English and speak in their grandmother's language, human teachers and human doctors and human engineers who came 30 light years from their world to spend their careers on someone else's. And this morning, 12 human ships and 47 weapons installations built into atmospheric processors, and a ship that is not in any database, fighting for 4 hours and 415 lives to hold a line that someone decided 19 years ago with 4 words would be held. He said, I have spent 19 years trying to understand why. He said, my granddaughter Vale, who was born on this colony and has never seen our homeworld, told me this morning, with the certainty of someone who has never had reason to doubt it, that's what they do. They help. He said, I think that is the answer. I think after 19 years and 4,000 pages and every document and interview and committee minute, the answer is what a 12-year-old said in a shelter while waiting for the humans above to do what humans did. He said, they helped because that is what they do, not because it was required, not because it was practical, because we needed help and they were there and that was enough of a reason. He said, that is the end of my history of the Silvari people. He paused, then he said, no, that is not the end. He said, the end is this. We are still here. 40,000 of us on a world we did not build alone, under a sky that is orange in the morning, alive. My granddaughter will grow up and have children, and those children will grow up, and the language I write in every day will be spoken by people who were not alive when it almost died. He said, that is the end. He turned off the recorder. Above the colony, Ruth Carver held her ships in position and would hold them until the sector command reinforcements arrived, because that was what you did when you told 40,000 people they were safe. You stayed. The Dominion was gone and the morning was clear, and the colony was intact, and 415 names were in the log, and she would read every one of them, and she would carry them the way commanders carried names. In the settlement's central square, the memorial to the Silvari homeworld stood in the morning light. Human hands had built it from descriptions. It was not exactly right. It could not be exactly right, built from words rather than memory, constructed by people who had never been to the world it represented. but it was close enough that the survivors who had seen the homeworld recognized it, and the children who had not seen it knew it from the memorial, which meant it was close enough. Vor came up from the shelter with Vale beside him, her hand in his, and they walked through the settlement in the orange morning, and he looked at the colony the way he looked at things he was going to write about, with the historian's attention that saw everything and judged nothing, and tried only to record accurately. He saw a colony that should not exist. He saw 40,000 people who should not be alive. He saw a human teacher counting children by touching them on the shoulder. He saw human ships holding their positions above the settlement. He saw the memorial and the school and the agricultural zones and the medical center. He saw what 4 words became when the people who said them meant them. Vale said, walking beside him, "Can we go to the memorial?" He said, "Yes." They went to the memorial. They stood in front of it in the orange morning light, the representation of a world that no longer existed, built by hands that had never seen it. And Vor looked at it and felt what he always felt standing here, the specific combination of grief and gratitude that had no single word in any language he knew. After a while, Vale said, "Grandfather." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to learn more about it. The homeworld, will you teach me?" He looked at her, 12 years old, her grandmother's eyes, born here on this colony, under this orange sky, with the Silvari homeworld existing for her only as a memorial in a square, and pages in a history that her grandfather had been writing her entire life. He said, "Yes, I will teach you everything." She nodded. She looked at the memorial for a moment longer. Then she said, "And then maybe someday I can teach my children." Vor stood beside his granddaughter in the morning light of the only home she had ever known and thought about that. About children not yet born being taught by a child who was 12 years old and had never seen the homeworld and carried it anyway, in her language and her face, and the way she said "we" when she meant the Silvari, as if we were a thing that still existed and always would. It did exist. It was standing in a square on a colony 30 light-years from Earth, looking at a memorial and holding her grandfather's hand. He said, "Yes, you will teach your children." Above them, the human ships held their positions in the orange sky, steady and present, doing what they did. They stayed.